What if the story behind It Ends With Us isn't the one fans were promised? What if the real drama isn't on screen but behind the camera, where new leaks suggest Blake Lively may have held more control than anyone ever imagined? Tonight we dive into the text messages that could change everything, exposing a power struggle that reaches far beyond Hollywood's bright lights and deep into the heart of one of the year's most talked about films. Begins with whispers that started as rumor, but quickly turned into a storm when private messages between members of the film's post-production team surfaced. Online messages that revealed one chilling phrase. Blake call, a term that might sound harmless, but inside the walls of Hollywood, it meant authority. It meant decisions made not by the director, not by the editor, but by Blake herself. According to these messages, she wasn't just acting, she was shaping and guiding, even the scenes that didn't feature her name on the call sheet, and that revelation sent shockwaves through every corner of the entertainment industry, because suddenly the woman who claimed to be a bystander was being painted as the one calling every creative shot. One editor, Henry Grace, expressed frustration in a private chat using the phrase, "shaking my head over how much control Blake reportedly had even over a young Lily scene," a sequence so emotionally vital that fans of the book saw it as the very soul of the story. Grace mentioned she had approval over it, not as an actress, not as a producer, but as someone who had to personally sign off on the final cut. Of that moment, the question immediately became, why? What about that scene made her feel she needed that level of power? The leaked exchanges hinted at tension between editors and production staff, suggesting that certain changes were not optional, but required by Blake's direction. One producer reportedly sighed and said that decisions of Blake call a line that now feels less like workplace banter and more like a clue in a much bigger story behind the curtain. People began to wonder, was this collaboration or control? Fans who adored the novel felt uneasy. Could their beloved story be reshaped through one person's vision, rather than the author's intent? And inside the studio, the debate grew louder as people struggled to balance respect for Blake's talent with growing discomfort over her influence. Sources familiar with the film's development have described how creative conversations began feeling less like teamwork and more like permission requests. The kind of subtle shift that changes everything quietly at first, then all at once. Even as these whispers spread, Blake's team stayed silent publicly, focusing on promoting the movie while privately battling legal headlines tied to her ongoing disputes elsewhere. But every silence has a sound, and in this case it echoed through the industry. One editor called it unprecedented, another described it as delicate but defining. This wasn't just about one scene anymore. It was about the idea that a film could be molded to fit one image, one reputation, and one narrative that had to be protected at all costs. As the days passed and the leaked messages spread across social media threads, what began as quiet curiosity turned into full-blown speculation. People wanted to know why Blake Lively had so much influence over creative elements that were traditionally left to directors and editors. And soon the phrase Blake call became a symbol of something larger than a film. It represented the ongoing conversation about power perception and control in Hollywood. Insiders started to connect the dots, pointing out that her authority on the set of It Ends With Us may have gone far beyond what most producers, even executive ones, would normally be granted, especially for scenes in which she never appeared. The most telling example involved a crucial sequence featuring young Lily, the emotional heart of Colleen Hoover's original story. That scene had been written to reflect vulnerability, innocence, and trauma. But according to editor Henry Grace, changes were made, and those changes were reportedly signed off only after Blake's approval. This kind of oversight was not just rare. It was almost unheard of in the post-production process, where actors typically have limited input once filming wraps. Yet here was a situation where decisions were being delayed or redirected until Blake gave her confirmation. According to one editor's message, the team even joked about keeping certain creative choices quiet until she was in the right mood, because pushing back too hard could jeopardize progress. And though that may sound like harmless workplace chatter, it carried a darker undertone of exhaustion and quiet frustration. This wasn't a battle over ego. It was about artistic direction. Who owned the final vision of the film? Was it Justin Baldoni, the credited director? Or was it the woman whose name now hovered over every edit like a shadow? While most fans assumed these stories were exaggerated, others couldn't ignore how often the leaks aligned with the visible shifts in tone between early trailer previews and newer cuts released online. There was a noticeable polish, almost too smooth, a reworking of moments that once felt raw and unfiltered. One insider described it as emotional sanitizing, claiming that certain expressions of pain and realism had been muted to better fit Blake's preferred image. And while no one could officially confirm who made those calls, the leaked Blake call messages seemed to fill in the blanks. This revelation collided perfectly with another growing controversy: Blake's legal filings in the ongoing Wayfair lawsuit, which had started as a dispute about defamation and retaliation, but had evolved into something far messier. Her team submitted an entire deposition transcript to the court, every unedited word, something nearly unheard of in Hollywood law strategy. Analysts immediately questioned why her attorneys would take such a risk, since only a few relevant pages were needed. The rest of the document contained hours of unrelated conversation tone, shifts, and unfinished thoughts, all of which were now public. Some believe this decision was a calculated distraction, a way to flood headlines with legal theater while quietly steering attention away from the Blake call texts. Others thought it was simply an overreach, a desperate attempt to control a story spinning too fast to contain. But either way, the result was the same. The spotlight on Blake Lively grew brighter than ever, while her claims of being the victim of a smear campaign began to lose credibility in the public eye. The irony could not have been sharper. She had sought control to shape perception, but the harder she tried to control it, the less believable her narrative became. And behind the polished statements and public smiles, the cracks were beginning to show. It was no longer about one film, one court case, or one set of messages. It had become a question of character. How much power is too much when protecting an image becomes more important than protecting the truth? And as each new leak surfaced, that question became harder for even her most loyal supporters to answer. The silence after the storm is always the most dangerous. It is the moment when the world pretends everything is normal, when the cameras pack up, when the hashtags fade, and when the people involved start to believe maybe they escaped the fire. But underneath the ashes, something still smolders, because truth never dies. It just hides and waits for the right moment to ignite again. And that is exactly where we find ourselves now. Watching the same faces who once smiled for the cameras now hiding, behind lawyers, behind statements, behind new projects. Because the world does not forget. It only pauses, and when it resumes, it comes back sharper, more curious, more ruthless, in its pursuit for what was never answered. And that is what makes this moment so fascinating. Because even when the world has moved on from the headlines, the people inside them have not moved on from the consequences. They are haunted by the things they said, by the text messages that may one day be read out loud in a courtroom, by the relationships they destroyed trying to protect something that was never real in the first place. And when you peel away the glamour, you start to see something raw, something broken, something human. These are not just stories about fame or friendship or betrayal. These are stories about survival and desperation, about people who built their lives on illusions, and then had to watch those illusions crumble in real time. And what comes next is not redemption, it is exposure. Because when you strip everything away, the truth has a way of revealing itself. Not in grand gestures, but in small moments of weakness. A trembling hand, a nervous glance, a silence that lasts just a little too long. That is where the truth lives, in the spaces between what is said and what is meant. And when the truth begins to surface, it does not come gently. It comes like a flood breaking through the walls. People spent years building, and that is what we are seeing now. The cracks widening the facades, slipping the alliances breaking apart, not in explosions, but in whispers and documents and late-night calls from publicists who can no longer control the story, because the story has outgrown them. And there is something poetic about it, the way every secret eventually eats its keeper, the way every lie needs constant maintenance until one day it collapses under its own weight. And the weight here is enormous, because we are talking about reputations, empires, brands, millions of dollars at stake. But what is money compared to trust? Once that is gone, everything else becomes fragile. And in this case, trust is not just gone, it is obliterated. We are watching people who once called each other family, now rewriting history, pretending the warmth was never real, pretending the betrayal never happened, pretending they never sent the messages that now exist on someone's server somewhere, waiting to be subpoenaed, waiting to be read, and the knowledge of that alone is enough to drive anyone mad. Because how do you live knowing that at any moment your version of the story can be destroyed by someone else's proof? How do you sleep knowing that the narrative you crafted so carefully could unravel in a single day? That is the kind of pressure that changes people, that makes them lash out, that makes them desperate, that makes them dangerous. And that is exactly where the energy is right now behind every smile. There is fear behind every denial, there is calculation, and behind every apology, there is strategy. It is a game of survival dressed up as sincerity, and the public is watching every move, dissecting every word, every outfit, every caption. Because we know by now nothing in this world happens by accident. Everything is orchestrated. Everything is messaging, and when someone suddenly disappears from social media or skips an event or posts something cryptic, we know it means something, we just don't know what yet. But we will, because the truth has a timeline. And it is closing in every message, every call, every whispered conversation has a way of finding the light eventually. And when it does, it never arrives quietly. It detonates. And in this story, there are too many detonators waiting to be triggered. Too many secrets hidden in plain sight. Too many people pretending not to know what they know. The silence is temporary, the reckoning is not. And that is what makes this next part inevitable. Not a question of if, but when. And so here we are standing, at the edge of the story where everything that was hidden begins to stir, where the lines between loyalty and self-preservation blur into something unrecognizable, where every word spoken in confidence becomes evidence and every friendship becomes a liability. It is the place where masks finally start to slip. Not because people want to be honest, but because they have no choice. The pressure has built for too long, the cracks too wide to cover anymore. And the irony is that everyone saw it coming. They just hoped it would happen to someone else. Because that is how this world works. It runs on the illusion that exposure is selective. That if you are careful enough, curated enough, you can stay untouched. But no one stays untouched forever. Not when the internet remembers. Not when the cameras catch everything. Not when people who once protected you now have every reason to protect themselves. And that is the stage we have entered now. The stage where alliances become weapons, and the people who built the same empire begin quietly dismantling it piece by piece, trying to save themselves from the collapse they helped create. And the silence between them is deafening. They do not text. They do not call. They watch each other from a distance, through statements, through leaks, through carefully worded headlines. And every time a new story drops, the question becomes who leaked this and why? Because nothing leaks by accident. Not in this business, not in this war. And that is exactly what it has become. A war of perception, a battle for control, fought through lawyers and gossip columns, through deleted posts and legal filings, through whispers that somehow always find their way to the right journalist. And in the middle of it, all the truth remains unchanged, waiting patient, cold, unbothered, because it knows time is on its side, and time is the one thing these people are running out of fast. Because the longer they try to bury it, the louder it echoes back, and soon even, the audience starts to feel it, that shift in tone, that quiet understanding that something big is about to happen, something irreversible. You can feel it in the pauses during interviews, in the sudden cancellations, in the eyes of people who know they are being asked questions they cannot answer. The tension has reached a point where silence is no longer safety. It is confession. And you can sense the unraveling now. Not with explosions, but with exhaustion. People are tired of pretending. Tired of defending, tired of maintaining a story that no longer makes sense. And that is when the most dangerous thing happens. People start to talk not for revenge, but for relief. They start to admit things in fragments to friends, to lawyers, to strangers. In DMs, they start to let the truth slip out like steam from a cracked pipe. And once that happens, it cannot be reversed because every fragment leads somewhere. Every confession triggers another. Every attempt to control it only magnifies it, and soon the story becomes bigger than any one person, bigger than any lawsuit or statement or PR campaign. It becomes history. It becomes the record. And that is the one thing no one in this world can rewrite. And that is the tragedy and the beauty of it all, that after everything, the fame, the power, the manipulation, the spin, the truth still wins. Not because it is louder, but because it lasts longer. It outlives them all. And you can already feel that shift happening as names once whispered are now spoken out loud, as receipts once hidden are now public, as the people who thought they were untouchable realize they are not immune to consequences. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, there are the fans, the public, the observers piecing together the timeline. Like detectives reading between the lines of every post, of every silence, of every denial, and they are starting to see the pattern, the one that was always there. But no one wanted to believe that behind the glamour, there was strategy behind the kindness, there was calculation behind the loyalty, there was leverage. And when you finally see it, you cannot unsee it. The story has changed. The players have changed. And now everyone is waiting for the final reveal because there always is one. There always comes a moment when everything falls into place and all the contradictions finally make sense, and we are moments away from that moment. Now the air feels heavy with it, the internet hums with it, the world is holding its breath, waiting for the truth to finish what it started, and when it does, nothing will ever be the same again. Not for them, not for us, not for the story that brought them here. And now, as the dust settles and the lights dim, what remains is not the spectacle or the scandal or the endless noise of commentary. It is the stillness after the storm, the part no one ever films, the quiet realization that truth is never about destruction. It is about revelation, about showing people as they are, not as they pretend to be. And when the world finally sees that reflection, it cannot look away, because it recognizes something familiar, something human, the need to hide the fear of being found, the desperate attempt to control what others think of us. And that is why this story matters, not because of the names or the headlines, but because it reminds us that even in a world built on illusion, the truth has patience. It waits, it watches, it survives, and eventually it wins. Not in fire, but in silence, in the quiet acknowledgement that nothing can stay buried forever. The people involved will move on. They always do. They will smile again, stand on red carpets again, tell new stories again. But deep down, they will know they have been marked by the truth. They tried to outrun. They will carry it like a shadow, invisible, but always there. And for the rest of us, watching from the outside, we learn the oldest lesson of all, that no matter how polished the surface, the cracks will always show that power without honesty collapses, that every secret comes with an expiration date, and when it arrives, it demands to be seen. So we wait for the next truth to rise, for the next mask to fall. Because in the end, it always does. It always will, and when all the noise fades, when the headlines shift and the internet moves on, what remains is the silence. The kind that lingers long after the storm has passed. The kind that forces people to sit with what they've done. The kind that reveals who they really are. Because at the end of every story built on secrets, there comes a reckoning. Not loud, not cinematic, but quiet, unrelenting and absolute. The truth never needed to win. By force, it wins. By endurance, it outlasts everyone who tries to bury it. It sits in the background, patient, watching as people build towers of denial around it, knowing that one day they will crumble under their own weight. And that is what has happened. Here, the illusion is gone. The perfect image shattered, the careful balance destroyed, and what's left is not ruin but revelation. The realization that behind every controlled narrative, there were cracks. Behind every public smile, there was fear. Behind every alliance, there was a contract waiting to be broken. And when it all came undone, no one could stop it. Because truth does not negotiate. It does not wait for permission. It simply arrives. And when it does, it exposes everything. Everyone, and every motive, even those who thought they were safe. Because in this world, safety is a myth. There are only choices and consequences, and every lie told to protect someone else eventually turns into a trap for the one who spoke it, the people. At the center of this story, learned that the hard way that silence can be as incriminating as confession, that friendship can be as dangerous as rivalry, and that no amount of fame or money or public favor can protect you when the story decides. It no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the audience, to the public, to history. And once that happens, control is gone. And all that's left is acceptance. The acceptance that no one wins by hiding, that survival without truth is only temporary. That redemption begins only when the mask is dropped. And for some, it will come too late. They will rebuild, but they will never forget the moment the world saw through them. Because that is the price of illusion. It always ends the same way, with truth waiting in the dark, ready to rise again, and the world ready to listen. Because even after everything, people crave honesty more than perfection. They forgive mistakes. they do not forgive manipulation. And that is the lesson that echoes through all of this, that the truth always finds a way. It may take months or years, it may destroy or cleanse, but it will surface. And when it does, it reminds everyone watching that in a world obsessed with appearance, authenticity is the most dangerous and the most powerful thing of all.